All right, chapter 7. We're going to talk about, hold on one second. We're going to talk about inverse and direct variation, and then what we're going to talk about for the next few days after that is going to be rationals, which I told you yesterday was just the grown-up fraction. So there's two ways to look at and talk about indirect and direct variation. God bless you. It says you've learned that two variables x and y show direct variation when y equals a times x for a non-zero constant. That doesn't mean anything to you guys. I understand that. What does the word inverse or indirect mean? Opposite, yes? So this is what I want you guys to focus on. All right, we're going to talk about two different concepts. Direct variation is y equals a times x. And inverse or indirect is y equals a divided by x. All right, how do these look different and how do they look the same? How are they similar? They both have x's. What else do they both have? Y's, and they both have what? A's, okay? How are they different? One is multiplying, and the other one is what? Dividing, okay? So they're definitely opposites of each other. A, in both cases, is a constant. It's a number. In some cases, we're going to solve for A. What direct variation means is as your x value increases, your y value increases. Or as x decreases, your y value decreases. They go in the same direction. We'll say it that way. With indirect variation, it's opposite. As x gets bigger, what does y do? Gets smaller. Or vice versa. They go in opposite directions. So when you are given an equation or they're asked you to figure out if something is direct or indirect, you always are going to solve for y. We'll talk about that. The second thing that we're going to do is figure out indirect and direct by solving for the constant, and it looks a little differently. So let's move on to the example. You guys can look at this a little bit. It says, tell whether x and y show direct, indirect, or inverse, or neither. That got cut off. Neither. So the first thing you're going to do and how you figure this out is you solve, not show, solve for y. And then let's look at it. So in letter A, all right, A says xy equals 5. Solve the equation for y. So what do? Divide both sides by what? Divide x. So y equals 5 over x. Is that direct variation? Is it y equals a times x? Is it y equals, God bless you, a divided by x, or is it neither? It's a divided by x, so this is inverse. This would be, God bless you, inverse variation. So it's really easy to look at an equation and tell what it is. Solve for y and then figure it out. Look at B. B's already solved for y. It says y equals x minus 4. Is that direct, indirect, or neither? Direct is multiplication. Indirect is division. So this is what? Neither. Good. All right, let's look at C. Again, how do we do this? You don't just look at the equation itself. You have to solve for what first? Solve for y. So in C, how do I get y all by itself? Multiply both sides by 2. Perfect. So this becomes y equals 2x. What does that match? Direct. In this case, if I asked you guys what your a value was, what your constant is, you would tell me it's what number? 2. In letter A, what is your a value? What's your constant? 5. Okay, good. So those are pretty simple. Let's do a couple more. Let's do look 1. What do I do? How do I solve for 1? So I'm going to say 6x equals y. If I'm going to figure out direct, indirect, or inverse, I should say, or neither, solve for y. Is this already solved for y? Yes. Yeah, it's just written on the opposite side. So is this direct, inverse, or neither? This is direct. What's your constant? What's your a value? 6. Perfect. All right, let's look at 2. 2 says xy equals negative 0.25. How do we figure this out? We first solve for y. So divide both sides by x. So you have y equals negative 0.25 divided by x. Inverse, direct, or neither? Inverse, good. In this case, what is your A value? Negative 0.25, good. And then look at the last one. Is this inverse, direct, or neither? Neither, very good. Does anybody have any questions about that? When you're given the equation and asked for direct, inverse, or neither, you have to solve the equation for y. If I solved number 3, y plus x equals 10. If I solve for y, do you guys agree I'd have 10 minus x over here? That does not portray direct nor inverse. It's not multiplying x by a constant. It's not dividing x by a constant. So that's why it's neither. Yeah, you guys all right? All right, now change up a little bit. It says tell whether x and y show direct, inverse, or neither. But this is different. I don't have the equation. So in this case, the first thing you have to do is find the constant. And I'll show you how to do that in a second. What I mean by that is, what do you multiply, divide, what do you get from one point to the next should be the same number every time, and we're going to figure that out. If you find xy, if x times y is the constant, this is going to show inverse. You guys are like, wait a second, you just said x times y gives me, or you just said multiplication gives me direct. When it is multiplied, it's a times x, not x times y. So, and I'll show you in a second how this works. If you find that you divide y and x, that's your constant, then you have found that it's direct variation. And the reason why that is, okay, if you solve, here's inverse, here's direct. So if I solve and I say, okay, y equals a over x. This is inverse, correct? Right, you guys told me that, correct? At the beginning, we talked about that? So when you're given a table or a chart, it says tell whether this is indirect, inverse, or sorry, direct, inverse, or nothing. You have to find the constant. Well, if I find the constant, how would I get a by itself? What am I actually doing? If I solved for a, what would you do? Multiply both sides by what? So that's why when you find the constant and you're multiplying the x and the y and you get the same thing every time, that's why it's inverse. Same thing over here. If I think it's direct, it's y equals a times x. Well, to find the constant, what would we do to both sides? You would divide by what? So in this case, your constant would be y over x. So given an equation, you solve for y and then see what it looks like. Given a table, you solve for a. That's the difference. So the way that you guys would show me this work for letter A, I'm going to first figure out if I multiply x and y, do I get the same thing? And I'm going to figure out if I divide x and y, do I get the same thing? So when you multiply letter A, what's 2 times negative 12? Negative 24. What's 4 times negative 6? Negative 24. What's 6 times negative 4? Negative 24. What's 8 times negative 3? Negative 24. Do you get the same thing every time? Okay. Now, if you were to check to see the opposite, you say y divided by, so negative 12 divided by 2 is negative 6, right? So then negative 6 divided by 4 is not, right? So you're like, oh, wait, that's not it. So you see that your constant is negative 24. Negative 24. Every time, negative 24. So you just proved to me that what kind of variation occurs here? Inverse. So we'll do the same thing over here. Let's find x times y, see if that's our constant. Let's find y divided by x, see if that's our constant. So if I say x times y, 2 times 1 is 2, okay? 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 3 is 20. Is that a constant every time? Is that the same number? No, so that's not that one. What about if we divide? So 2 divided by 1 is 2, yeah? 4 divided by 2 is 2. Okay, good. What's 8 divided by 3? Is that 2 again? Is that 2 again? No. So does this work either? No. So if it's not inverse and it's not direct, what do we say that it is? Neither. Good. All right, let's do a couple more of those. That's a little confusing, I know that. Remember, we're solving for A. We're solving for A. So if A works out to be y times x is your constant, then you have inverse. Write that down. If A happens to be y divided by x is your constant, then you have direct. If neither of those are a constant, then it's neither. So the way that you show me your work is you say, okay, fine, I'm going to do x times y. What is 20 times negative 4? Negative 80, okay. What is 15 times negative 3? It's not negative 80, is it? So you can stop. You say, nope, it's not that one. What about if we divide? Y divided by x. So 20 divided by negative 4 is negative 5. What's 15 divided by negative 3? Negative 5. What's 10 divided by negative 2? Negative 5. What's 5 divided by negative 1? Negative 5. So is this value constant in between every x and y value? Yes. So what did you just prove? What kind of variation do you have? Direct. Very good, guys. Again, same thing. Let's do x, y. 60 times 1 is 60. 30 times 2 is 60. 20 times 3 is 60. 15 times 4 is 60. Do you have a constant when you multiply the x and the y every time? Yes. So which variation do you have? Inverse. Very good. Very good, very good, very good. All right. We're going to change it up a little bit. It says the variables x and y vary how? Inversely. If they're telling you, both is fine, that's fine.
And this one's empty. So.
Oh, you can just go back. Thanks, honey. If they tell you they vary inversely, what does your equation look like? Y equals what? A over x. Okay? So they say the variables x and y vary inversely, and y is 4 and x is 3. Write an equation that relates the two. So the first thing you have to do is solve for what letter? Got to solve for A. Good. So they tell me that y is 4, and they tell me that x is 3. So how do I solve for A? What do I do to both sides? I'm going to multiply both sides by 3. So what is your A value, guys? 12. So your equation to show how y and x vary inversely would be y equals 12 over x. There's your equation. The first thing you do when they give you the x and the y is you solve for the A. You solve for the constant. And now they want to evaluate when x is what number? Negative 2. So y equals 12 divided by negative 2. What does y equal? Negative 6. There you go. So when they're asking you to write the equation, you have to first solve for A. And then you can go ahead and plug in whatever values they want you to. So let's do all three of these. You guys can handle this, no problem. They tell you that they vary how? Inversely. So step 1 is to solve for A. So my inverse variation says y equals A over x. Well, what two letters did they give us? They told me that y is 5 and that x is what? 4. Okay, so how do I get my A value? What do I do? Multiply both sides by 4. Great. So A equals 20. So what does my equation look like that relates x and y? Y equals what? 20 over x. Perfect. There's your equation. And then what do they want us to evaluate with? So now I plug in 2. So y equals 20 divided by 2. Y equals what? Perfect. Again, we're varying inversely. So y equals A over x. I'm going to plug in negative 1 for y. And my x value is 6. So what do I do to both sides? Multiply by 6. Great. So your A value is negative 6. So what does my equation look like? Y equals what?
-6.
-6 over x. Perfect. Problem.
Do you have candy?
Yeah,
I'm gonna just take it.
sure. Do you have a money envelope or no?
No.
All right, so here's a word problem. So immediately you guys tell me, I can't do this. It's too hard. Yes, you can. Let's talk through direct and inverse variation problems. There are some keys that you can say, oh, okay, this always happens this way. It says time and hours it takes a group of volunteers to build a playground varies inversely. Okay, inversely. Right away they're telling you what kind of an equation to write. Right? Varies inversely with the number of volunteers. It takes a group of 10 volunteers 8 hours to build a playground. So let's think about this. You have to figure out which variable goes with which amount. Time versus the number of volunteers. Let me give you a little hint. Time is always the x-axis. It's always the x value. So what this equation should say is they're using t and n. It should say n equals a over t. Your x value is always time. Always. So in this first equation, we have to write the equation that we're then going to use to plug in all these numbers. But how do I figure out this equation? What did we just do? The last few problems, they gave me the x and the y, correct? Yes or no? So didn't they give me the x and y already? All right. My number of volunteers is 10, and the hours that I use, my time is 8. So how would I write this to figure out, first of all, what the a value is? 10 equals a over what? 8, okay? How do I solve for a? Multiply both sides by, perfect. So a equals 80. God bless you. The constant that you have to use in your equation is 80. So to figure out, when I make a table and figure out all these values and stuff, I use the equation n equals 80 over t. N is the number of volunteers, and t is your time. Remember, your x value in anything, whenever you graph, whatever, time is always the x-axis. So if you have two variables and they give you time, it's going to be the x. So they ask you to write a table using these numbers. So you have your n and your t. It's just like saying x and y. So I have 15, 20, 25, and 30. You guys agree? So when n is 15, I'm going to plug this in and say, what do I do? What's my equation? So how do I solve this? If I have an n value, guys, and I have an equation, how do I solve this? Plug in. Okay, so 15 equals 80 divided by t. I have a fraction equal to a fraction. How do we answer a question like this? Algebra. Algebra 1. Fraction equal to a fraction. We can cross multiply. There you go. Just cross multiply. So 15t equals 80. Divide both sides by 15. You guys don't have a calculator. You don't need one. What goes into both 80 and 15? 5? All right. So if I divide this by 5, I get 16 over 3. All right, so 16 over 3. All right, so let's evaluate with 20. So my number of volunteers went from 15 to 20. The number of volunteers increased. What should happen to the time then? If you have more people helping, then it should take less time, right? If they vary inversely, the more people you have helping, the less time it should take. So when I plug in 20, I have 20 equals 80 over, over t. Fraction equal to a fraction, so we cross multiply. Divide both sides by 20. How many hours is it going to take? T equals 4 hours. All right, so think about it. Some of you guys are like, 16 over 3. I don't know. How many times can 3 go into 16 without going over? 5, right? So this is really 5 1/3. So as the number of volunteers went up, what happened to the time that it took to do? It went down because it varies inversely. That's how that should work. All right, let's evaluate when I have n equals 25. So 25 equals 80 over t. Cross multiply. So you have 80 equals 25t. Divide both sides by 25. What number goes into both of these? 5, right? So 80 divided by 5 is 16. 5 divided by 5 is 5. All right, so you have 16 over 5. How many times can 5 go into 16 without going over? 3 whole times and 1 left over. So again, I went from 4 hours to when I increased my volunteer number to 25, I went down to just about 3 hours, right? You guys see that? So when we increase our n value to 30 volunteers and we cross multiply, we have 80 equals 30t. Divide by 30. So t equals 8 over 3. How many times can 3 go into 8 without going over? 2 and a bit. 2 2/3. So what happened to our time? I've added 5 more people, so our time went which direction? Down. The less amount of people, the more time it took. So the question here says, what happens to the time it takes to build a playground as the number of volunteers increases? Well, you can say as volunteers increase, the time does what? Decreases. And why is that? Because they're varying how? Directly or inversely? How are they varying? It says it right there, inversely. Inversely means opposite. As the time goes up, the volunteer number was lower. As the volunteer number goes up, the time is lower. You guys see that correlation? Some of you are still at Mass. All right, in example 4, it takes 10 volunteers 12 hours to build a playground. How long would it take 15? Anybody have any idea how to do this? There's a couple different ways you could do it. The best thing to do is just be to set up a proportion. 10 volunteers takes how long? 12 hours. Okay. So they want to know with 15 volunteers, how long would it take? What do we do when we don't know something in math? You solve it, put a variable there and figure it out. So guys, this is just a proportion. Cross multiply. What is 10 times x? 10x equals, what's 12 times 15? 15 times 12. Anybody? What is it? 180? Okay. So divide both sides by 10. How many volunteers did this take? Or how many hours, I'm sorry? 18 hours. Which I solved yesterday as I was going through my notes. That's why I said the answer at the very beginning. All right, so you guys have now 35 minutes. You should be able to get a majority. Actually, I don't think the bell rings till 10:50. So you should be able to get a majority, if not all, of your 7.1 homework done. Feel free to work together.